Chapter 1. "I don't see why I have to get married now," complained Connor Darasharillian, Crown Prince of Castellane, Duke of Maracon, an honorary title he inherited from his mother, and Potentate of Sarima, a small deserted island near Taprobana that had been claimed by Castellane some decades ago, when a merchant ship planted the lion flag upon its few feet of shoreline. As far as anyone knew, the flag was still there, leaving Castellane's claim to the rocky protuberance uncontested. Kell just smiled. Connor was looking dramatically aggrieved, which did not actually mean he was feeling dramatically aggrieved. Kell knew Connor's expressions better than he knew his own. Connor might be annoyed about the pressure to get married, or he might be annoyed about the speech the Queen had ordered to give him in Valerian Square today. The reason he and Connor were currently jammed into a carriage with blacked-out windows, boiling hot, and squashed between velvet cushions with Jolivet and Mayesh glaring at them from the opposite seats. Or he might not be annoyed at all, and simply be indulging his flair for the dramatic. Either way, it wasn't Kell's problem. He wasn't the one trying to talk Connor into a politically advantageous match. In fact, he was against the whole idea. He was quite comfortable with the way things were, and Connor marrying would upset the balance. "Then don't get married," growled Jolivet. He was dour as ever, despite being decked out in full uniform. Miles of gold braid, scarlet tunic and trousers, and a helmet so profoundly ceremonial that while he was currently carrying it in his lap, the plumes brushed his chin. Mayesh Benjamin beside him looked like a ragged gray crow by comparison. He wore his plain counselor's robes, his curling white hair spilling over the collar. But then, as an Ashkar, he was only permitted to wear blue or gray in public, which vastly limited any potential senatorial splendor. "That cousin of yours in Detmarch can be king of Castellane, and you can take yourself off to head up the army. Give General Archambault a rest on the border." Kell held in a laugh. It was true that when a Castellani royal family had more than one heir, the second was usually trained up to become the leader of the army. If Connor had had a sibling, he could have swapped places with them, though Kell could not imagine Connor doing any such thing, even in theory. He hated insects and dirt, and the army, as far as Kell understood, involved a great deal of both. Besides, he was young, only 23, and had years to get married and produce an heir. Mayesh and Jolivet were just being anxious, like clucking old hens. Connor raised an eyebrow. "Nonsense," he said. "I'm far too good-looking to risk spoiling my looks in battle." "Scars can be charming," Kell noted. "Look at Montfaucon, always surrounded by adoring courtiers." "If only one could be assured one would go off to fight and return with only a dashing cut on the cheek," said Connor. "The more likely outcome, a pike to the face, is less attractive. Anyway, it's not as if there's a war going on now." Connor always moved his hands expressively when he spoke, a habit Kell had spent years learning and copying. The little bit of light in the carriage glinted off Connor's rings as he gestured. He was richly dressed, as befitted a prince about to address his people. Their best crown, a gold circlet etched with wings, fine wool trousers, and tulle leather jerkin, the leather cut out in small diamond shapes to show the silk and metallic thread of the shirt beneath. It was horrendously hot, which Kell knew, since he was wearing the same thing. "There is no war currently," said Mayesh, "and consolidating alliances with other countries via marital connection is one way of making sure it stays that way." He opened the leather notebook on his lap. Inside were dozens of portraits and sketches done on various kinds of paper, all sent from hopeful courts and holdings across Dannemore and beyond. "Princess Aimida Dion of Sarth, 20 years old, speaks 6 languages. Mother was a famous beauty. Docile." "Docile means dull," said Connor. He had pulled off one of his rings and was tossing it from hand to hand. It sparked in the dimness of the carriage as it flew, like a colorful firefly. "And what do I care what her mother looks like?" "Perhaps they're offering 2 for the price of 1, suggested Kell, and saw Connor smile. There were various aspects to the job of being sword catcher that went beyond Kell simply putting himself between the Crown Prince and possible harm. Connor was usually surrounded by people telling him what to do in a fearfully serious manner. Kel felt himself tasked with providing some balance. Mayesh was not amused. "I believe," he said, "the suggestion is that the daughter, like her mother the queen, will one day also be a great beauty." "Is she not one now?" Connor took the paper from Mayesh. "Red hair," he said. "I loathe red hair. Besides, Sarth." Jolivet snorted. Before Castellane had gained its independence, it had been the port city of Magna Caladas, a vast empire now split into the 3 separate kingdoms of Sarth, Valderin, and Castellane. Valderin had been its further south, and even now contained most of the farms from which Castellane sourced its food. Castellane had been its shipyard and harbor, and Sarth had been its capital, containing the once imperial city of Aquila. It was common knowledge that Sarth yearned to build the old empire up again. They longed especially for Castellane's harbor, for they were landlocked, forced to pay steep fees to Valderin for access to the coast. "He has a point," said Jolivet. "Why give Sarth a foothold here?" "Why, indeed?" Mayesh drew out another sheet of paper. "Here we have Princess Elsabet Belmeny of Malgasy." "Malgasy," Jolivet said thoughtfully. "A useful ally, especially since your father fostered at their court. They trade richly in spices, fur, and silks, with reserves of arable land that would mean we were no longer dependent on trade with Valderin for crops," Mayesh noted, though there was a curious lack of enthusiasm in his voice. "Arable land," said Connor. "Never have more romantic words been spoken. So many ballads written about beautiful women with vast tracts of arable land." "If that's what they're calling it now," said Kel, and Connor grinned before taking the sheet of parchment from Mayesh. "You needn't talk about land as if it's nothing," grumbled Jolivet. "In trade we are indeed a great power, but in land we are only a few square miles of city and marsh." "But what square miles they are," said Kel peaceably, and Mayesh smiled. Connor held up the piece of parchment he'd snatched to show Kel the portrait of an intense-looking young woman with pale skin and black hair, her forehead bound with a gold circlet surmounted by a ruby phoenix. Elsabet Belmeny. Kel frowned. "I feel as if I've heard her name recently." Connor snapped his fingers. "Yes! Some sort of scandal. House Belmeny is highly disliked by the folks of Malgasy. It seems an unpleasant situation to involve oneself in." Jolivet made an exasperated noise. "There are anti-monarchists in Castellane as well, Connor." Kel scratched at a bit of the black paint on the carriage window, as Connor and Mayesh argued about whether House Aurelian was or was not universally loved. Through the clear spot of glass, Kel could see that they were on the Ruta Magna, the last section of the great southwestern road that ran from Shenzhou to Castellane. The Ruta Magna cut through the mountains from the narrow pass, crossed the city, and ended at the harbor. Kel often wondered what the other end of the great road looked like. He knew it dead-ended in Shenzhou's capital, but did it become the main thoroughfare of that city, as it had in Castellane, or did it simply fade into a scatter of streets, like a river bleeding into a floodplain? Connor always told him he was odd for wondering about such things, but Kel dreamed often of the far-flung corners of the world. From their window in Maravent, he could see the harbor and the great ships returning from Cayenne and Teprobana, from Kutani and Yenschnatz. Someday, he told himself, someday he would find himself aboard one of those tall ships, sailing across the raveled blue silk of the ocean, hopefully with Connor beside him. Though until now, Connor's promise that they would one day travel the world had yet to materialize. Not through any fault of Connor's, Kel knew. House Aurelian had kept its prince unusually close. "Oh, very well," Mayesh snapped. He showed annoyance rarely. Kel turned with mild surprise to see that the counselor had taken out a new sheet. "If Malgasy displeases, here we have Prince Floris of Gelstadt. Young, handsome, will one day control the largest banking empire in the world." Connor's general preference was for women, but it was by no means a rule. If Connor married another man, a woman of good breeding would be chosen to be the lady mother, who would bear Connor's child, nurse it, and give it over to the two kings to raise. It had been the situation with Connor's grandparents, a prince of Castellane and a lord of Hans. It was generally not uncommon in Dannemore. Marriages between two queens were rarer, but not unheard of either. Banking empire? Connor stuck out his hand. Let me see. Kel looked over the prince's shoulder as he perused the sketch. The boy in it, depicted leaning against an alder tree, was good-looking, with flax-colored hair and the blue eyes common to Gelstadt, a tiny country whose liberal banking laws had made it one of the richest in Dannemore. Connor glanced up. What do you think, Kel? The atmosphere inside the carriage changed subtly. Kel, who had spent the past decade attuning himself to nuances of social interaction, felt it. He was a sword catcher, the prince's servant. It was not his place to give an opinion, at least not in Jolivet and Mayesh's view. It was perhaps one of the few things they agreed on. Kel was not sure why he should care. All who worked in the palace were loyal to the blood royal, but he was loyal above all other things to Connor. It was a choice he had made long ago, as a small grubby boy in borrowed clothes, facing the Prince of Castellane, who had offered him an extraordinary life, and had given him that and more, an extraordinary friendship to go along with it. I think, Kel said, that either someone has drawn that tree very small, or Florus of Gelstadt is a giant. Good point, said Connor. I hardly want to marry someone who looms over me. How tall is he, Mayesh? Mayesh sighed. 7 feet. Connor shuddered. Mayesh, are you trying to torment me? An unpopular princess, a giant, and a redhead? Is this your idea of an amusing jest? It is taking years off my life. This may be treason. Mayesh held up a new sheet of parchment. Princess Angelica of Kutani. Connor sat up, finally interested. Cal couldn't blame him. The painting was of a dark-skinned girl with a cloud of black hair and luminous amber eyes. A cap of golden mesh set with star-shaped diamonds was her crown, and more gold glimmered at her wrists. She was luminously beautiful. Kutani, said Jolivet, sounding dubious. Would Castellane be able to afford such a dowry as they would certainly demand? Kutani was an island kingdom, a center of the spice trade. Cardamom, pepper, saffron, ginger, and cloves all grew or were traded there, making the kingdom spectacularly rich. According to Jos Falconet, whose house was granted the spice charter, the island air was scented with cardamom, and the trade winds blew across the beaches soft as powder. So true, said Mayesh, setting the paper aside. Probably not. Connor's eyes flashed. We are rich enough, he said. Give me that back. They had turned off the Ruta Magna onto a narrow lane behind the city's central square, where a plaza was formed by 4 of the oldest buildings in the city. All were clad in white marble, veined with quartz that glittered in the sun. All boasted broad steps, columns, and arched porticos in the style of the bygone Calatian Empire. Valerian Square had once been the Kudra Magna, the central hub of the imperial port city. At each cardinal point stood a massive structure dating from the time of the empire. To the north, the Tully. Its steps were guarded by marble lions, their mouths wide open, as if to catch criminals in their jaws. To the west was the Convocate, to the south, the Judicia, to the east, the Porta Aurea, the triumphal arch erected by Valerian, the first king of Castellane. Citizens fondly called it the Gate to Nowhere. Castellane has something of a confusing relationship with its past. Today marked the yearly anniversary of Castellane's independence from Magna Calatus. The Castellani had fierce pride in their city-state, feeling it to be the most superior place in Dannemore. Yet they also prided themselves on their descent from Calatians, and on what they had kept from the time of the Empire. Everything from the hypocausts that heated the public baths to the courts and the Council of 12. Independent, but also tied to the glories of a domain long past. Kel sometimes thought he was the only one who observed the contradiction. Kel and the others drew up behind the Convocate, where a hidden entrance would allow them to pass into the building without being seen. The lane had been closed off to all but royal traffic at both ends. As Kel swung down from the carriage, he saw a group of small children peer from the shadows, wide-eyed. They were ragged, barefoot and scrubby, freckled by the sun. He thought of two small boys under a powder-bark tree playing at pirate battles, and flipped a copper coin in their direction. "Present my greetings to the ragpicker king," he called. The smallest of the boys gave a frightened gasp. "They say he's here today," he said. "Somewhere in the crowd." "As if you know what he'd look like," scoffed a girl in tattered pinafore. "You ain't never seen him." The smaller boy puffed up angrily. "I does know," he protested. "He goes round all in black, like Gentleman Death come to take your soul, and his carriage wheels are stained with blood." Rolling her eyes, the older girl pulled the boy's ear decidedly. The boy yelped, and the children vanished back into the shadows, giggling. Kel chuckled. As a child, he thought of the ragpicker king as the trickster god of pickpockets. Later, he began to understand that the ragpicker king was a practical, not a mythological figure, however mysterious. He ran smuggling operations of elegance and size, owned gambling hells deep in the Warren, and had his fingers in trade from the harbor to the Great Road. The palace could do nothing to rid the city of his presence. He was too powerful, and besides, Mayesh said, it was better not to create a vacuum of power at the top of any organization. Unlawful order was, after all, an improvement on lawful chaos. Jolivet snapped his fingers. "Come along, Kellyan," he said, and the group of four crossed the deserted streets and entered the convent. It was dark and cool inside, the marble acting to shield the interior from the heat. Kel found himself walking beside Mayesh as Jolivet strode beside Connor, speaking to him intently. "That was cleverly done," in the carriage, admitted Kel. "Show him 3 candidates he won't want to marry, then show him one he will, and tell him he cannot have her." "It is both your task and mine," Mayesh said, "to know the prince better than he knows himself. Only you have other tasks, and I merely have the one. You must also know the king and queen." Mayesh made a gesture that seemed to indicate agreement without commitment. "I only offer them counsel. So it has always been." This was manifestly untrue, but Kel didn't feel like arguing. It was better not to delve too deeply into any discussion of the king and queen, especially when it came to the king. Connor was giving the yearly speech of independence today because the queen would not appear. She loathed public speaking. And the king could not. Marcus Aurelian, the great scholar, the philosopher king. His wisdom was a point of pride in Castellane. He did not appear often in public, it was said, because he was busy with his learning, his great discoveries in the fields of astronomy and philosophy. Kel knew this was not true, but it was only one among many secrets he kept for House Aurelian. They had reached the central chamber of the convent, where broad marble pillars upheld an arched roof. The mosaic floor, which depicted a map of Dannemore before the breakup of the empire, had once been colorful. Now it was worn down to a faint shadow by the passage of time and countless feet. Once there had been seats here. Once the king had sat in session with the charter families, discussing law and trade and policy. Kel could dimly recall when this had been still the case, before the king had retreated to the North Tower, with his telescopes and astrolabes, his map of stars, his sextants and spheres. Before the king had turned his attention to the skies, and forgotten the world below them. But there was no point thinking about that now. Several of the Aero Squadron were approaching. They gleamed in red and gold like Jolivet, though they sported considerably fewer tassels and less fringe. The leader, a gray-haired man named Beneset, said grimly, "Legate, sir. There's been an incident." Beneset explained. A dock worker found in the crowd with a crossbow strapped to his back. Probably nothing, of course. There was every possibility he was unaware of the law that forbade going armed into an appearance of one of the royal blood. The Tully would uncover the truth. In the meantime, "We will need the sword catcher," said Beneset. "Is he prepared?" Tension had spread through his shoulders, tightening his muscles. Stepping in for Connor was not a rare occurrence. It was always a flip of the coin, as the guards were more cautious. It was not even the danger he minded, he thought, as he drew his talisman from his pocket and looped it around his neck. It lay cold against his throat. For reasons he could not guess, the metal never warmed from contact with his skin. But he had relaxed today. They were nearly at the square. He could hear the crowd. He had let himself assume he would not be needed. He had been wrong. As quickly as he could, he began to run down the words of the speech in his mind. I greet you, my people of Castellane, in the name of the gods. Today... Kel frowned. Today, something. Today, Castellane was born... No, that wasn't it. I don't think it's necessary, Connor said, interrupting Kel's reverie. One drunken idiot wandering around with a weapon hardly means an assassination attempt. It is necessary, Monseigneur. Kel knew that the flatness in Jolivet's voice and knew what it meant. The legate had the power to restrain the prince physically, vested in him by the king, if such action was required. This is why you have a sword catcher. Connor threw up his hands in disgust as Kel came over to him. They locked eyes. Kel shrugged minutely, as if to say, It doesn't matter. With a sigh, Connor slipped the crown from his head and held it out to Kel. Try to look handsome, he advised. Don't disappoint the people. I'll do my best. Kel settled the crown on his head. His rings were paste jewels, but the crown, that was real. That belonged to House Aurelian. It seemed to carry a weight beyond the physical heft of bullion. He looked up, blinking. The Aero Squadron had thrown the doors open wide, flooding the interior of the convent with bright sunlight. Kel could hear the roar of the crowd like the rush of the sea. Connor held out his hand. Kel grasped it, and Connor pulled him in close. This part was ritual, muscle memory. Kel had done it countless times, though he still felt a faint shiver up his spine as he looked at Connor, as he felt the weight of the gold circlet on his brow. I am the prince's shield, he said. I am his unbreakable armor. I bleed that he might not bleed. I suffer that he might not suffer. I die that he might live forever. But you will not die, said Connor, releasing his hand. It was what he always said. Not part of the ritual, but habit nonetheless. Unless Lady Elaine gets her hands on me, said Kel. Lady Elaine had a wealth of ambitions, most of them focused on her only daughter. She's still angling for you to marry Antonita. Jolivet scowled. Enough, he said. Mayesh, will you remain with the prince? It was less an order than a question. Mayesh indicated that he would, and Kel joined Jolivet in the long walk to the doors. The noise of the crowd grew louder and louder still, until Kel stepped through the doorway to the covered loggia beyond, all its arches brilliant with white marble. He heard the crowd take an indrawn breath as he moved to stand at the top of the white cascade of steps that led down to the square, as if they all saw him at once, all breathed in at once. Kel stood at the top of the grieving stairs and looked around the square as they chanted Connor's name. The crowd spanned wealthy class and occupation, from dock laborers and rough cambric, their children perched on their shoulders to get a better view, to shopkeepers and publicans. Rich merchants had driven their shining carriages into the square and gathered in groups dressed in bright colors. On the steps of the high temple stood the Hierophant, the high priest of Castellane, carrying a staff topped with a milky cinder-glass orb. Kel eyed the old man sideways. It was unusual to see the Hierophant away from the temple, save for great occasions, such as state funerals or the marriage to the sea, when the king or queen of Castellane would board a boat wreathed in flowers and hurl a golden ring into the ocean to seal the bond between Aegon and the House of Aurelian. Closest to the steps sat the charter families, atop a dais that had been erected before the lions of the Tully, each family beneath a pennant bearing the sigil of their house. A ship for House Rouverge, a wreath for Esteve, a silk moth for Elaine. Kel swept one last glance over the crowd, catching sight of a shining black carriage with scarlet wheels. Against it leaned a slender, long-legged figure, all in black. He goes round all in black, like Gentleman Death come to take your soul, and his carriage wheels are stained with blood. Could it be the ragpicker king came to see the prince speak? Kel supposed he could, if he felt like it. As a child, he asked Connor why the palace didn't simply arrest the ragpicker king. Because, Connor had said, looking thoughtful, he has too much money. Enough. Kel knew he was letting his nerves direct his imagination. Concentrate, he told himself. You are the Prince of Castellane. He closed his eyes. Against the darkness he saw a blue sea, a ship with white sails, heard the sound of waves and the call of gulls. Here, where the western stars drowned with the turning of the world, he was alone in the quiet, with the horizon beckoning. The ship rocked beneath him, the mast at his back. No one knew this place but him, not even Connor. His eyes snapped open. He reached out his hands to the crowd, the thick velvet of his sleeves falling back, the rings gleaming on his fingers. The crown was heavy, a bar of iron across his forehead. He said, I greet you, my people of Castellane, in the name of the gods. His voice, amplified by the talisman at his throat, it echoed through the square. My people. Many in the crowd brandished the red and gold flag of Castellane, the ship and the lion, the sea and the gold roads. There was a rug worked into the shape of the land of Dannemore and the palace library. Connor walked upon it sometimes in bare feet, now in hind, now along the gold roads, now returning to Castellane. So the world was to a prince. Today, Kel said, and the words rose up in him unbidden but remembered, is the day of our freedom, the birth of our city-state. Here among the streets did the people of Castellane lay down their lives, that they might never again kneel to an emperor, nor bow down at the feet of a foreign power. Here did we become what we are, a shining beacon to all the world, the greatest city in Dannemore, in all the world. The crowd roared. The sound was like thunder, like a storm growing closer and closer, until it seemed it would shudder the sky apart. In this moment, it did not matter that Kel was not truly their prince. The cheering lifted him up as if he walked the sky roads like lightning-struck enemy. Their excitement seemed to catch along his bones, as if his marrow were filled with black powder. He felt it as a fire rising, becoming a blaze within his blood. It was overwhelming to be so loved, even if the love was not truly directed at him, even if it was an illusion. Very good, said Connor, when Kel had come back into the convocate. The crowd whipped up into a frenzy, in part by the appearance of the crown prince, but also, it had to be admitted, by the free alcohol provided by the palace. It was still roaring outside. Tankards were being given out at booths hung with red and gold banners as the noble families packed up their belongings and hurried back to the hill. Soon enough, the patriotic crowd would become a raucous and celebratory mob. I like the part about the heart and soul of Castellane being... What was it? Oh, yes, the citizens. Extemporaneous? I thought we rehearsed it. Kel leaned back against a pillar, feeling the cool marble against his back, his neck. He was very hot all over suddenly, though he had not felt the sun when he stood atop the grieving stairs. People like to be complimented. Are you all right? Connor, who had been sitting with his back against a pillar, scrambled to his feet. Jolivet and Mayesh were deep in conversation. The Aero Squadron paced up and down the room, silent as guards always were. Connor usually forgot they were there. You look... Kel raised his head. He and Connor were of the same height. Kel was sure somehow Mayesh had made sure of that, as he had made sure that Kel's eyes, over the years, had turned the color of tarnished silver. Yes? Nothing. Sunstruck, perhaps. It'll do you good to get into the dark. Connor put a hand on Kel's shoulder. Today is a day of celebration, so let us celebrate. Go and change your clothes in the carriage, and we will head to the caravel. Right, Kel sighed. As he often did after public appearances as Connor, he felt an exhaustion deep in his bones, as if he had been stretched into a peculiar position for hours. He wished nothing more than to return to the palace and collapse into bed. Jos Falcon's party. Why the reluctance? The corner of Connor's mouth curled up. It's been too long since we visited the Temple District. The Temple District was a neighborhood of pleasure houses. It had earned its name because most brothels kept a house shrine to Turin, the god of desire. Kel half wished to ask if they could go some other evening, but it was clear Connor was looking forward to the party.
And besides, Kel himself had some business in the caravel quite apart from the usual, and tonight would be a good time as any to conduct it. Nothing, Kel said, only Falconet's gatherings can be excessive. Connor chucked him lightly under the chin. Excessively enjoyable. I've already asked Ben and said to bring the horses round. You can ride Asti. Beneath the light tone, Connor sounded anxious. He knew Kel didn't want to go. The offer of Kel's favorite horse was a bribe. For a brief moment, Kel wondered what would happen if he refused. Said he would return to the palace with Benjamin and Jolivet. Spend the evening in a dark room with a cold blue wine and a map of the western seas. The answer was not much, but Connor would be disappointed, and he would still need someone to accompany him to the caravel. Connor could not ride out into the world alone, unprotected. He must always be defended. If Kel returned to the palace, Connor would be assigned a guard from the Arrow Squadron to watch him, and would be accordingly miserable. And if Connor was miserable, Kel would be miserable. Not because Connor would take it out on him. He wouldn't. But the knowledge that he had let Connor down would eat away at him like caustic. Kel slipped the crown from his head. He held it out to Connor, the gold circlet dangling from his fingers. Very well, he said, but do not forget your crown, Monseigneur, lest they treat you disrespectfully at the caravel. Unless, he added, being treated disrespectfully is what you're paying for tonight. Connor laughed, the anxiety vanishing from his eyes. Excellent! We will have a memorable evening, I think. He turned to wave his crown breezily at Benjamin and Jolivet, who gazed at the two young men with matched expressions of stony disapproval. We bid you good afternoon, gentlemen, he said. Should you wish to find us, we will be in the Temple District, offering the appropriate prayers.